Hello everybody, welcome to another Wednesday video. Just a quick preamble this time. The normal planned subject for this Wednesday's video unfortunately didn't happen, and that's because over the weekend I ended up getting the first shot of the COVID vaccine. Now you might be wondering, hang on Drac, you're not in the target demographics at the moment for the UK government. Well, that's true, however Mrs. Drac is, because of a pre-existing health condition, and since we live in the same household and I took her to the vaccine centre, their attitude was effectively, well, we might as well get you with a needle as well while you're here. This, obviously, is a good thing, except for the fact that apparently this thing knocks you for absolute six for quite a while. So instead of having the weekend to finish up and record and then a little bit more time to edit, render and check everything, I basically have just been flat out the entire, well, past several days. And so, today, instead, as with the video quite a while ago on the last stand of The Revenge, I'm instead going to bring to you a reading from the book Against the Odds, Battles at Sea, 1591 to 1949, by Alexander McKee, which is a rather nice summary of various battles that occur where there's a very unexpected outcome because the battle is weighted very heavily against one side, except it goes in their favour. So, with all that said, let us look into today's incident. This is the fight between HMS Indefatigable and HMS Amazon and the French ship of the line, Droit de l'Homme. And for reference, Indefatigable is a Rasé frigate, Amazon is a much smaller frigate, and Droit de l'Homme, as I said, is a full-on ship of the line. So how on earth did they win? Let's find out. After the revolution in France, the aggressive policy of the Directorate, as the government was then known, had been astoundingly successful in Europe. The policy of l'attaquer et toujours l'attaquer, aided by much superior manpower, had increased the influence of France. As one result, first Holland and then Spain declared war on Britain. Their fleets, combined with that of France, completely outnumbered the British Royal Navy and made the landing of troops on British soil a practical proposition. The French planned accordingly. In 1796, the French General Hoche met the Irish representatives Arthur O'Connor and Lord Edward Fitzgerald in Switzerland. A major landing in Ireland was contemplated, using 25,000 French soldiers. The Irish told the French that 15,000 would be sufficient, for the moment they landed, 250,000 armed Irishmen would join them in the struggle against the English. The French, who had not engaged in Irish diplomacy before, were carried away by the prospect put before them and expanded their invasion plan to include India, although further thought convinced them that the conquest of Ireland was practical in a single campaign. The final plan was technically good, unlike, say, the Spanish Armada in 1588 or the not-too-serious German Operation Sea Lion of 1940. 3 different places inside Bantry Bay on the west coast of Ireland were chosen to fit different wind conditions, and even if conditions were impossible there, the mouth of the River Shannon offered an alternative. The extreme southwest coast of Ireland was also the right place for a French beachhead, politically and militarily. It assumed there would be little opposition from the British Navy. A more questionable assumption was that December and January were favourable months for launching a seaborne campaign, particularly on the southwest, facing bays and estuaries when southwesterly gales could be expected, although tactical surprise might be gained thereby. Armies are exposed to weather, but not half so much as fleets. The base for the invasion was Brest, and the French naval base in Brittany in the northwest corner of the Cherbourg Peninsula, south of Devon and Cornwall, and offering a convenient passage to the southwest coast of Ireland. But by the 15th of December of the invasion year, 1796, only 2 of the 3 French warship squadrons had assembled at Brest. The 3rd squadron under Villeneuve, the future loser of Trafalgar, had not yet arrived. Even so, the French fleet numbered 17 ships of the line, 13 frigates, 6 corvettes, 7 transports, and an ammunition frigate. These carried 18,000 soldiers of the land army, together with their guns, horses, and stores. The British fleet had gone into Portsmouth for the winter, leaving a squadron of 13 ships of the line and a few frigates to lie off Brest. The line ships remained safely, in view of the onshore gales, some 40 miles out to sea, but the British frigates kept stationed so close in to Brest that the French were deceived into thinking that the ships of the line were only just over the horizon in sight from their tops. Fearing that their fleet could be destroyed in detail if it emerged in line through the main channels, the French decided to come out by a dangerous and little-used channel. Then the weather blew up and made that route impossibly risky, and they changed their minds. To signal the alteration of plan, a corvette was stationed to fire guns, rockets, and blue lights along the correct course. However, a British frigate charged right in amongst the main body of the French and began to fire rockets, guns, and blue lights. This confused the French so much that their ship of the line Séduisant went aground and, as a distress signal, also fired guns, rockets, and blue lights. The line ship was lost with more than half of the 1,300 men on board, and the emerging French fleet was scattered into small squadrons, each inferior in force to the united British squadron waiting over the horizon. The French Navy and Army commanders, who had embarked together in a fast frigate, were not in contact with any part of their force, which was now technically leaderless. The British squadron did sight a French force, but it was Villeneuve arriving late and he escaped. In a storm weather pursuit, the British suffered gale damage and were scattered. At the end of December, the British admiral had only 6 of his ships in company when he returned to Portsmouth, the main British base on the south coast. Notwithstanding these misadventures, the main body of the French invasion fleet made their emergency rendezvous off Ireland, with only 1 ship of the line and 3 frigates missing, apart from the wrecked Séduisant, lost at Brest. But in one of the missing frigates were the Navy and Army commanders of the force. The officers next in line to them in seniority took over. They were Admiral Bouvet and General Grouchy, who later helped Napoleon to lose Waterloo. They decided to carry out the landings as planned. That winter was the coldest in living memory, and the weather at sea was wild. On Christmas Day, while the British were trying to get their main battle fleet out of Spithead, its anchorage off Portsmouth, the French were trying to disembark their soldiers, guns, and stores in Bantry Bay. The weather, their only opponent. It was impossible. After days of trying to invade, all they achieved was the loss of some ships and damage to others from running aground or colliding with each other. Eventually, they gave up trying, and the force returned to France, in small groups or individually. One of the last to leave, on the 7th of January 1797, was the new 74-gun ship of the line Droits de l'Homme, commanded by an experienced and senior officer, Commodore Jean-Baptiste Lacrosse, with General Jean-Joseph Humbert commanding the 749 soldiers aboard. In addition, there were 639 French crew and 105 prisoners from captured British ships, including 2 women and 6 children. On the 13th of January, the ship was overtaken by foul weather blowing out of the Atlantic, while heading for Belle Isle on the coast of Brittany, where there were a number of secure bases. Through the rain, driving over a sullen sea, Lacrosse sighted 2 large ships. He did not know they were French and was glad to lose sight of them, in case they were part of the British blockading squadron. 2 hours later, with the rising note of the coming storm beginning to howl through the rigging and set the blocks rattling, backing southwest as indication of worse to come, 2 more ships were sighted, this time ahead, between the lone ship and the land Lacrosse was making for. The larger of these 2 looming ships was the Indefatigable, a former 64-gun ship of the line, cut down to 44 guns on a single main deck to turn her into a powerful frigate, and commanded by Sir Edward Pellew. It was Pellew in this frigate which had caused the mayhem at Brest in December, and which had resulted in the wreck of Séduisant. He was now back on his blockade station. Some 8 miles astern of him was the 36-gun frigate Amazon under Captain Robert Reynolds. Almost at once the situation changed. Frigates were too lightly built to take on a ship of the line. Indeed, they were forbidden from engaging them. If any captain did so, and lost, as he was virtually bound to do, the verdict of his inevitable court-martial would ruin him. War is a business like any other. But now, with the gale making all the ships plunge heavily and the squalls gusting aloft, the topmasts of both the fore and mainmasts of the Droits de l'Homme were carried away, leaving a chaos of canvas, cordage and broken spars on deck and hanging over the side. The mainsails were still drawing. What was affected chiefly was the manoeuvring power of the anyway clumsy ship of the line. This was decisive for Lacrosse. Once he had the wreckage cleared away, he steered east before the wind for the safety of the Brittany bases. Pellew, the best frigate captain of the age, weighed the chances. The ship of the line had 3 times his firepower, and her heaviest guns were the big 32-pounders mounted on her lower deck. In addition, for every seaman aboard there must be at least 1 soldier. In men he must be outnumbered 5 to 1. On the other hand, ships of the line carried their main armament lower down than a frigate. In this sea, the working of the battleship's largest guns would be hampered. She would have to keep her ports closed until it was time to fire, and then be very careful to choose the right moment, or risk having her whole lower gun deck swamped. The gunpowder cartridges would be soaked, the flints useless. For a gun battle at a distance, her complement of soldiers would be a disadvantage, as her decks must be uncomfortably crowded. His own crew were battle-experienced, used to working and fighting together as a superb team. By the time Pellew had come within range of the battleship, it was about 5:30 p.m., almost completely dark on a winter's afternoon, heavy with rain and bitingly cold in the wind. The seas were surging and vicious. Under topsails only for better control, Pellew took the Indefatigable across the almost defenceless stern of the Droit de l'Homme and fired his guns into her as they bore. Then he drew ahead in an attempt to repeat this raking manoeuvre on the battleship's equally ill-armed bow. But Lacrosse foiled him and got off a dangerous broadside, backed up by the pepper-pot fire of the French soldiers' muskets. The French Commodore then tried to run alongside the frigate and board, but Pellew evaded that manoeuvre. The Amazon, under Reynolds, came into action at about 6:45 p.m. when it was fully dark. She had been 8 miles astern when Pellew opened fire, and since then, with much sail set, had been steering on the gun flashes. Reynolds closed astern of the French battleship, fired a broadside into her quarter, and attempted to turn and break the Frenchman's stern with the loaded battery on the other side. Lacrosse tricked both his enemies, manoeuvring the frigates to his weather side, the highest side of the heeling ship of the line. Now he could open his lower deck ports and run out the heavy 32-pounders. No frigate could stand much of this, and Pellew drew ahead out of the arc of fire to repair rigging and bring up more ready-to-use ammunition from the hold. Reynolds could not have remained even if he wanted to. He had a lot of sail on in order to come up, and could not take in canvas while his crews were busy at the guns. In the ship of the line, however, there had been a bad accident. A 24-pounder gun had burst. Possibly a wave had stopped up its muzzle at the moment of firing. Apart from casualties due to the explosion and flying fragments on the gun deck, all the other gun crews would become wary in case the same thing happened to their own pieces. At 8:30 p.m, the 2 British frigates came in again to the attack. They had to keep clear of the battleship's broadsides, or as much as they could. The batteries of 32-pounders on the lower gun deck and the 24-pounders on the upper gun deck could smash them, particularly the lighter 36-gun Amazon. So they tried to keep on either side of the bluff bows of the Droit de l'Homme. For his part, the French commander, by yawing from side to side, endeavoured to bring at least some of his guns to bear, and with luck be able to close and board. But the British captains were alert to that and did not give him the chance he wanted. The ships were heeled over away from the direction of the rising storm, steadier than a modern powered vessel would be, but the lower parts of their heeled decks were awash. The gun crews sometimes wading waist deep in water. How they kept the ammunition and ignition dry is a wonder, or how they served their guns at all. Normally in a gale one wants at least one hand, sometimes 2 for oneself, and another, if there's one left over, for the job that one has to do. Otherwise one can be hurled the length or breadth of the deck, with subsequent damage. It is possible to be wedged into a corner and holding on with both hands, and still be hurled loose down to the deck. The weight of the guns was between 2 and 3 tons apiece. They were placed on carriages with 4 small wheels, which served to slow recoil, and were controlled by a system of ropes and pulleys attached to ring bolts let into heavy frames in the side of the ship, and finally braked at the end of their recoil by a breeching rope also fixed to ring bolts in the ship's side. The gun was fired when as close to the port as it would go, the recoil taking the piece inboard where the bore could be cleaned of any burning fragments of the charge by ramming a sponge down the muzzle and turning it several times. At every third shot it had to be additionally cleaned using a kind of screw known as a worm. To insert a fresh charge of gunpowder into smouldering fragments of the last cartridge was not wise. After the new cartridge had been inserted and rammed down the barrel to the far end so that it lay under the vent of the hole, the shot was then rammed down on top of it and secured with a wad of old rope or similar material. Using the tackle, the gun was then rolled back to the port and aimed using a wedge to alter elevation and a spike to train it round. This neat description must now be translated into a heeled, heaving deck swept by water, rising and falling with the waves. If the guns being fired were on the low side of the ship, then they would have to be hauled uphill after firing, by use of the ropes and pulleys and plenty of muscle. If on the high side, then they would have to be hauled uphill into firing position, but their recoil could be augmented by the heel and the impact of the waves. In the Indefatigable, sometimes the controlling ropes broke and had to be renewed, and in several cases the recoil was so violent that the ring bolts were pulled bodily out of the side of the ship. Conditions in all three vessels engaged did not differ. It was the same for all, except that the ship of the line's guns were heavier. When the Frenchman's lower deck ports were briefly opened to fire the 32-pounders, the main deck became a river which the scuppers could not immediately dispose of, and water poured down on the unfortunate British prisoners, men, women and children alike, where they were penned below the waterline in the cable tier, unaware of how the battle went. Amid the flat thunder of the guns ran the rippling musket fire of the French soldiers, who had similar tasks of sponging out their pieces and equally tricky techniques of loading, and as a musket is a two-handed weapon, they had in addition the problems of how to wedge themselves in place in order to get off a shot. In these conditions the battle went on hour after hour, in numbing cold and mind-dazing noise and continual uneven motion. At about 10:30 the effects of the frigate's fire was seen to be taking effect. The mizzenmast of the Droit de l'Homme was visibly tottering. Lacrosse did not wait for it to fall, but limited the damage it would have caused by ordering it cut away so that it would fall clear. But in addition to square sails, the main fore and aft sail of the ship of the line was rigged on this mast. Its loss made the 74-gun ship hard to handle. The British frigates now took station on her quarters, close to her vulnerable stern and the command post on the poop deck, one on each side. At about midnight there was a sign that the battleship was in trouble. Instead of firing round shot, she began to fire shell, that is, hollow cannonballs containing an explosive charge detonated by burning fuse. Literally shells. She had exhausted her supply of solid shot, which is the best projectile for penetrating hulls. She had lost 103 men killed and 150 wounded. The Amazon had lost most of her mizzenmast, only a stump was standing, and so her manoeuvrability was also impaired. Besides that, her main and foremasts and their yards had been badly damaged, and her rigging had been repaired so often that there was no spare cordage left. There was 3 feet of water in the hold, but her casualties were only 3 killed and 15 wounded. The Indefatigable had all her masts standing, although damaged, and 4 feet of water in the hold. Her casualties totaled 19 wounded, no one being killed. But the Frenchmen, despite their fearful casualties, were still working their guns and the British were replying. The flash of gunfire still rent the blackness of the night under the racing clouds which hid the moon. At 4:30 in the morning of the next day, 14th of January, the storm stripped the clouds away, and the moon shone out over the tumultuous sea stained with foam. Lieutenant George Bell, stationed on the forecastle of the Indefatigable, ran aft to report. Land to the northeast closer than 2 miles, and a rage of breakers in front of that unknown coast. Before he could make his report, the officers on the poop had seen it too. This was a danger more deadly than the Droit de l'Homme and threatened all ships, but not equally. Pellew gave 3 orders in succession. Signal to Amazon, crippled by the loss of her mizzenmast, "You are standing into danger." To the gunnery lieutenants, "Cease fire," and to the sailing master, "Turn away to seaward across the wind." The last order was the tricky one. For a sailing ship to turn across the wind is difficult. If too much canvas is carried, she may be dismasted and must then drive ashore. If too little, she will not turn all the way, but will stall and broach amongst the waves. Difficult in normal circumstances, but with torn canvas, cut rigging, damaged mast and yards, how much would the frigate take? The Indefatigable swung around, and at the moment of the stall hung for a moment, and then followed through until her sails filled on the other tack, and she could steer off from the peril of the coast. Pellew had judged it precisely. The Amazon, lacking the steering sail which had been shot away with the mizzenmast, could not repeat Pellew's manoeuvre, and there was no room for her to wear around with the storm. Before 5 a.m. she was ashore. 6 men who stole a small boat for their escape were drowned. The rest, including all the wounded, were got to land on rafts made up on the spot. The rafts, much safer than a boat in breaking seas, were simply drifted onto the beach by the wind and the waves. The Droit de l'Homme was less fortunate. She had already lost her mizzenmast. When Lacrosse tried to turn her up into the wind, both her foremast and her bowsprit carried away. Only her mainmast with the mainsail was left. Lacrosse ordered the anchors dropped, but they simply bounced across the sandy seabed without holding. She struck on an inshore sandbank, was carried further in by the breakers, and struck again, losing her mainmast. Still, the storm and the raging sea had not finished with her. She was forced further inshore, struck another bank, swung broadside to the combers racing in, then fell over on her beam ends, with the sea bursting right over her great hull. At this point, discipline seemed to break down. The officers and men who had fought so valiantly for many hours now looked only to themselves, or so it is said. I doubt that the critics fully realised their situation. The ship was not upright with a deck to stand on. She was right over on her side and half full of water. True, the shore was only a few hundred yards away, but struggling through pounding surf and giant waves is not easy for comparatively puny creatures like men. A sea like that in the shallows has awe-inspiring power. Swimming is of little use, you'd be underwater most of the time. All that could be done would be to cling on to some fitting inside the hull, or stand on top if you weren't swept away by the rearing combers, and wait for low tide. It is extremely difficult for the average author, and the average reader, to think themselves inside a ship of the line of nearly 200 years ago which is heeled near 90 degrees from the vertical. The only existing examples are wrecks. I'm thinking especially of another French battleship, the 54-gun Hazardieu, built in 1688, with the Droit de l'Homme as a 74 was built in 1794, which was wrecked in a gale on the coast of Sussex in 1706, having been captured 3 years earlier. She struck in shallow water, going over on her beam ends, in very similar circumstances and on an almost identical coast. Her guns, some of them still on their gun carriages, are there today, lying against the frames on her port side. Excavating those decks and those guns makes plain the predicament faced by the crew of Lacrosse's command. All honour to them that they got up their prisoners from below, even when overwhelmed by disaster. At this moment, no one knew where they were. Possibly an island off the coast of Brittany, perhaps even Brittany itself. The crew of the Indefatigable, having clawed off a lee shore, found themselves again facing breakers ahead, and having made another emergency turn, discovered yet more breakers lay in their path. They were trapped in the darkness inside some vast bay. About 6:30, with the coming of first light, they could see breakers hurling themselves masthead high into the air. Their course to clear them, and to avoid the perils of the shore they'd left behind them, meant wearisome beating up against the gale. 4 more terrible hours of sea-soaked toil for the exhausted men. By now the wrecks already ashore were visible. The Amazon, and 2 miles to the south of her, the huge whale bulk of the French ship of the line lying on her side, swept by the breakers. They were caught in the great bay of Ordierne, and the foam-spouting rocks ahead of them were the Penmarks, a reef of dire repute. To the watchers on the shore, it seemed that the British frigate was doomed to perish on the Penmarks, but Pellew had fought his way clear to open sea by 11 that morning. Reynolds, as we have seen, rafted all his men ashore, bar the 6 men who, without orders, had unwisely stolen a boat and drowned themselves. In the Droit de l'Homme, 2/3 of the seamen and soldiers were supposed to have perished, but modern research in France scales down this tragedy. The best figures, as few such figures can be wholly accurate even in modern times, give the total in her as 1,293, including British prisoners, and more than 600 as the number of dead. The French general on board, Jean-Joseph Humbert, was one of the survivors. He was to return to Ireland the following year, 1798, with another invasion fleet, this time in command of the whole force. As this amounted to just over 1,000 men, its main significance was as a prop to the rising of the United Irishmen in County Mayo. Humbert, who had started in life as a dealer in goat and rabbit skins at Lyon, had risen through the Revolution, winning fame under General Hoche in the Vendée, where the rebels were French. In Ireland, commanding French troops and Irish rebels, he inflicted on British soil at Castlebar a resounding defeat on the British army. But it was only a diversion intended to embarrass the English. On his return from Italy in December 1797, the new French star, General Bonaparte, had been appointed commander-in-chief of the grandly named Army of England. With 35,000 fighting men in 130 transports escorted by 13 ships of the line and 42 smaller warships, in the early summer of 1798 the Army of England set sail for Egypt. The man of destiny had decided that England was not an attractive or possible target. The remains of the Droit de l'Homme and the British Amazon lie buried still in the sand of Odierne Bay. Some interesting recoveries, including the ship's bell, have been made from the Droits de l'Homme as tokens of that appalling tragedy. And so there we have it, a brief recounting of the fight between the Indefatigable and Amazon against the Droit de l'Homme. It's a surprisingly nuanced and intricate battle that went on for a very long time and was basically fought between two very experienced commanders who knew exactly what they wanted to do. As events would pan out, Pellew had the advantage of his ships just being somewhat better equipped to deal with a fight in that kind of weather, and as a result, well, whilst he lost the Amazon, he did get his own ship out of there and he caused the loss of a French third-rate ship of the line. But as the book notes, the French fought valiantly with great skill, and even when their ship was over on its side and everybody was rightly panicking, they still showed a great deal of honour in making sure that even as discipline began to break down, they freed the prisoners who were below decks, which you can somewhat have forgiven them for forgetting in the midst of all the chaos and carnage. Pellew, of course, would go on to further great success in his ship, whose overall career we've summarised in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.